Sounds good.
And if everything went right, we're not live, really. Um, so I've got this bio for you. I listened to your conversation with Jason Miles, who, by the way, says hello.
Okay, well, hello, back.
I will let him know.
I enjoyed it.
And I'm looking forward to talking to you about the Lumpen. Did you get a chance to look at the questions I sent?
I did get the questions, good set of questions. I'll answer them, do my best anyway.
All right, great.
A good-
So what I usually do is start out with the person's bio. In this case, you can add to it. Um, so Clyde Barrow is the author of the book The Dangerous Class, The Concept of the Lumpen Proletariat, and he is a professor in political science at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He was recently featured in a short video on this channel that we titled Understanding the Lumpen Proletariat, and I'm glad to get him on the channel to expand on that topic, specifically on the topic of the lumpen proletariat and the lumpen's role in the rise and perhaps fall of Donald Trump. So, Clyde, welcome to the channel.
Well, thanks for having me on. Pleased to be here.
Yeah,
I'm been surprised at the amount of attention this book and this concept has garnered, but I'm certainly pleased by it.
yeah. Well, when we ran that short, based on the interview that Jason Miles did with you on the This Is Revolution podcast, many viewers and people on my Facebook wall, actually as well, objected that the lumpen. Well, they said that the lumpen proletariat were not a part of Trump's base, and particularly the objection was that the rioters at the Capitol were not proletariat but were petite bourgeois. What would you say to that objection? And do you think that Trump uses the lumpen proletariat as his own personal shock troops, or did he do that?
Well, I think he certainly did that in the case of the Capitol riots. And let me say that the objection that you've raised is probably the most common criticism that I've heard about the book and about my particular argument on this case. I think in some ways, I would recommend that I did give a more extensive answer to this particular question in writing in a reply to Brian Palmer on the Socialist Project blog. So anybody who wants to take a look at that could go look. But I'll just recap that here. I think that a lot of people, because the title of the book, but also because I am focused on the concept of the lumpen proletariat, have missed the overall argument that I was making in terms of comparing Donald Trump to the rise of Louis Bonaparte. My argument about Trump very much parallels the argument that Marx makes about Louis Bonaparte, which is that following the February Revolution of 1848, we eventually saw the rise of the June days, the more radical socialistic proletariat making increased demands. And that became a critical point at which both finance aristocracy became concerned, but more importantly, the petite bourgeoisie, which had been allied with the industrial proletariat, became concerned because as small proprietors, they were fundamentally committed to the concept of private property. They were concerned about the prospect of rising taxes. Two issues that we've seen during the Trump era about many of these right-wing organizations put property rights as one of their foremost concerns, and certainly taxes and the powers of the federal government as a concern. And so what you saw is that the petite bourgeoisie defected from the revolution during the June days, and they effectively became the electoral base for the rise of Louis Bonaparte, who was eventually elected. And I certainly don't dispute that in the case of Trump. I think one of the shortcomings of the book, and even in subsequent discussions, that I failed to distinguish between the electoral base and what I might call the mass base, which extends far beyond the electoral base. As I pointed out, on our best day, no more than 60% of eligible voters in this country ever vote, even for the president of the United States. So there's an awful lot of politics that takes place in this country outside the electoral system and outside the electoral process. And that's the point at where I think the lumpen proletariat frequently enters Marx's writings as a decisive political force, not the only political force. So if I was to sort of draw a general overview of how I read Marx's 18th Brumaire, Louis Bonaparte rose to political power on the electoral support of the petite bourgeoisie, largely with the acquiescence and tolerance of the finance aristocracy, who, though not terribly pleased by it, were willing to tolerate it as long as they could essentially pillage and loot the public treasury and enrich themselves with all types of skullduggery and financial chicanery. The critical entrance of the lumpenproletariat comes when it becomes increasingly clear to Louis Bonaparte that he is not going to win the ensuing election in 1852, and begins to cast about for ways to remain in power. A situation, again, that very much parallels what was happening with Donald Trump. That's the point where he begins to really mobilize in a very formal way what were then known as the Society of the 10th of December, which had replaced the Mobile Guard, which were effectively, in France at that time, the equivalent of these right-wing paramilitary groups we have in this country, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Proud Boys, and many others. Louis Bonaparte very actively mobilized them to support his coup d'etat. I would argue that the big difference between today and then is while Trump did attempt to mobilize this lumpenproletarian shock troops to overtake the government and to nullify the election, he failed. It didn't work in this particular case. And even in the book, I say, this may work, it may not work. We'll have to wait and see. But I thought one of the things that I was doing to sort of warn people, and I was accused of being alarmist, by the way, when the book came out and the blogs came out. I said, this is going to happen. He is going to mobilize these people to try to overthrow the U.S. government. And if you'll recall, the month before, the June 6th, 3 weeks before the June 6th Capitol riot, he met with the leader of the Proud Boys. He sent messages, and we're still finding things out with court filings that are being done now as these people are arrested, where there was clearly a very high degree of coordination behind the scenes. There was clearly very serious intent to nullify the election, possibly to assassinate public officials such as AOC and Nancy Pelosi. Much of that driven by the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and those were the two big ones.
On the topic of the Proud Boys, it's an interesting group because it was born out of right-wing media.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than it wasn't like a militia group is usually more organically formed. I would think it seems to me that it has been maybe connected to the John Birch Society or something like that. But for a long, long time, we've had these militias in the country, far right militia groups that are really armed, or often ex-military people, and they're they were involved in the Oklahoma City bombing. There's a real violent tendency in this country, and in a way, I guess they're a political force. The Proud Boys were brought together by a kind of failing stand-up comic named Gavin McInnes.
Mm-hmm.
He would initiate people into the group by making them name, I think it was 4 or 10 cold cereal brands that they liked, while someone was punching them on the arm, or a group of people were punching them on the arm. There's a silliness to the Proud Boys. Yep. And a media savvy behind the Proud Boys that you don't see in these other organizations. I don't know anything about the Boogaloo Boys, but my question is, do you think it's? I mean, the racism in the organization, I think, is there. Well, I just wonder, do you think that it's accurate to depict them as something similar to these militia groups? They seem like a paper tiger to me. They seem like a media creation to me.
Couple of things there. I think you make a very good point. One is I would not equate the Proud Boys with the official kind of paramilitary groups like the Oath Keepers or the Three Percenters. They do, however, have violent tendencies, and I think groups like the Proud Boys do provide recruiting grounds for those types of organizations, and they clearly went into the Capitol with violent intent, as I think the court filings are starting to document. The second point that I think you raise is very interesting is sort of the clownishness that surrounds so much of this. And one of the things that really caught my attention when I was rereading the 18th Brumaire before I wrote this particular book was the parallel between the language Marx uses in describing Louis Bonaparte's regime and the language that the media was using to describe the Trump regime. And it was this clownishness, the buffoonery, the silliness of it all, that it was just preposterous. But that clown show became the smokescreen behind which the chicanery and the corruption and the violence took place. And that, I think, is the parallel with Donald Trump. And if I could use the Capitol insurrection as an example here, we've all seen the photos of the silly guy with the horns and the fur coat and the things like this. And I could talk some about some of these folk kindred groups that are out there, particularly in the South and the Midwest, which are also heavily armed. But there was a lot of buffoonery and a lot of clownishness, even surrounding that. But I would argue that embedded within that were some very seriously organized, violent groups, even you could call them kill squads, that went in there with a plan and were financed by high finance. I mean, we've all seen, I think, 70 busloads paid for and shipped in by Clarence Thomas's wife. And we're only now beginning to uncover the extent to which there was a lot of big money behind that Capitol riot, paying for the protests, paying for the staging of this whole thing. Maybe, I don't know that they had that intent with their money, but they certainly financially supported it from the outside and brought those people to Washington, D.C., at a minimum, with the intent of overturning the election by seizing those vote certifications in the Senate.
Right. I mean, the Ted Cruz approach to trying to delay the certification and to draw into question whether or not the election was valid was a mainstream approach, a relatively mainstream approach. You didn't have to be part of the obviously reactionary alt-right or some underground militia organization to support the president's bid to overturn the election. But I want to go back to something else you said. You said that there's been evidence revealing there's new evidence revealing that Trump spoke to the head of the Proud Boys, who is not who I remember. The Gavin McInnes guy is quit, right?
It wasn't him. It was not Gavin McInnes. I think it was Terrio, I believe is his name.
Okay.
But that's public record. That was reported in the mainstream media at the time that it happened.
Was that after he said he didn't know anything about them in the debates?
I believe it was. It was sometime about the middle of December. I think it might even have been December 17th. And when it was reported out in the mainstream media, the response was, well, he was just there for a tour of the White House. He was just a tourist.
He came to the White House.
Yes.
He didn't it wasn't like an email exchange.
No, he was in the White House.
He was in the White House. Wow. And so the claim was, well, he went on a tour of the White House. He didn't meet with Trump. That would be their claim.
Well, to the extent that he met with Trump, it was like, just the same way that a president would greet any tourist in the White House, a wave of the hand and good to see you.
Okay. Do you believe that story?
Not at all.
Okay.
I think they were there planning January 6th.
Okay. Well, do you think that Trump actually believed that the group that he was assembling at the Capitol could stop the certification of the vote?
I do believe that.
Yeah.
I think that if you would watch his speech before that crowd on January 6th, right? He said very clearly, he's sort of invoking these code words. If you want your country back, you're going to have to go fight for it. And let's go down to the Capitol, right? He told them, go down to the Capitol. And it's very clear that a lot of them were headed for the room where the ballots were.
Do you think that the goal was to put pressure on the Senate to get them to delay the certification? Or do you think the goal was to round people up, shoot them in the head, take over?
I think it was a whole spectrum of motives. I think there were those who probably thought that if they just made a show of force in front of the Capitol, that they could pressure enough people in Congress to delay the certification and postpone the election. And probably got swept up into the course of events. I think there were others who thought who were there to storm the Capitol with the intent, if we can get our hands on that that box, we can walk off with it, and you legally can't certify election because of the certification. So we can do that. And then I think there were groups in there who were there to kidnap or assassinate officials, and in particular, the three that we've heard: AOC, Nancy Pelosi, and even Michael Pence, who was seen as having betrayed Trump.
I have a Facebook friend who is a Trump supporter who's found me on Facebook and through the podcasting and video channel, who is still communicating with me regularly, I mean, every couple of days, about the prospects for Trump regaining power.
Mm-hmm.
He's fallen into the QAnon rabbit hole. And I was told today that today is the deadline for Trump to use the military to regain control of the presidency. And we'll see if that deadline gets pushed off till tomorrow. But given the absurdity of some of the claims, it's hard for me to think. On the one hand, it's sort of, I find it difficult to worry too much about the threat from this group, right? Because they seem so out of, this guy particularly seems like a nice person when I've talked, because I've interviewed him twice to kind of try to get into the mind of the Trump supporter in this moment. He seems like a nice person, really, like polite and friendly. But on the other hand, he's willing to see things happen that is not at all nice, like the use of the military to create a dictatorship to overturn the elected officials in office now. And that would be okay because basically the feeling that there's a conspiracy between the establishment politicians, the financial sector, the banks, and then he starts to go off the chart into like demonic pedophilic creatures, and not spoken, but somewhere back there is always the Jews, right? Yeah. So but the what I'm unsure about is how this is really coalescing into an actual threat of political violence. I mean, I saw what happened on the 6th, but to me, it looked like it never had any shot at really accomplishing a coup. It seemed disorganized and like basically an error, that if they had a few more Capitol police there, that they wouldn't have gotten very far at all. Mm-hmm. Like it was a security failure. Do you think that in fact that the reason they were able to breach the Capitol was because of some sort of internal coordination within the state?
That's a difficult one. I suspect that we will learn more as time goes on. Certainly, we do know that there was some internal coordination with respect to not calling out the National Guard earlier, and that had been evidently at least set in motion well before, when Trump put his minions in there to ensure that didn't happen. How far that goes, I guess time will tell, and we'll find out more with time. There's a certain respect in which you could say, fortunately, that Trump was a failed Bonaparte. He wasn't able to pull it off. And in some respects, I think we're probably all very lucky that he was more preoccupied with personal vendettas and tweeting than he was with taking the reins of power. Had he been as focused as a guy like a Steve Bannon or a Steve Miller, I think we would have been in real trouble by now. And that we would have seen this script from the 18th Brumaire played out much more effectively than it was.
Yeah, well, Bannon is an interesting case because he was probably more instrumental in whipping up support for the Stop the Steal campaign than maybe is being reported. I'm following this podcast called The Wright Show. It's a guy named Robert Wright. And another fellow named Mickey Kaus. They're not either one of them leftists. One's sort of a center liberal and the other's a conservative. But Robert Wright has been listening to Steve Bannon for like the last 6 months. He'll come on his podcast and listen to what Bannon's saying now, listen.
Mhm.
And Bannon was walking right up to that line of calling for violence all
Yeah.
the time.
Yep.
And the people he had on, even more so. So what do you think it was that stopped? I mean, how did Bannon lose power, I guess, in the first place? And who should we thank for that? And do you think that we're likely to see another Bannon type figure arise?
Yep.
And where do you expect it to come from?
Yeah, I don't really know a lot about the internal details of why Bannon was pushed out of the White House as quickly as he was. I'm sure there were some internal power struggles he lost. I imagine there'll be a lot of memoirs coming out in the next few years that'll give us a lot of insight into that. But obviously, Steve Bannon is not going away. I don't think Trumpism, and this is the more important thing that Donald Trump himself personally, is that whatever we want to call it, Trumpism, fascism, Bonapartism, is not going away. It is very deeply embedded in American civil society at this point. And we're already seeing the competitors coming out to who's going to be the successor to Donald Trump and carry this torch into the future. Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley being obviously two of the leading proponents, but there are many others. Ron Johnson, they're just Matt Gaetz, Jim Jordan. I mean, we could go on. It's a long list of them.
Well, here's the thing about here's one of the big gaping holes in my understanding of the Trump phenomenon, and maybe this is my cynicism more than anything that's limiting my perspective. But two things. One is I don't see, when I look back over the last 4 years, a Trump agenda that really warrants the use of the coinage of the term Trumpism, because it doesn't seem to me as though he had a strong political agenda, certainly none that he was willing to fight for as president. The biggest thing he accomplished was tax breaks, which was really Paul Ryan plan, the old neoliberal Reagan wing of the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
There was Bannonism, but Bannon was ejected. So I could see the sort of nationalist, protectionist, almost social democratic vision of Bannon that would have been a possible agenda for the Trump administration, but it didn't even get close to getting enacted. So when you talk about the possibility of a coup, is it a coup like Louis Bonaparte's coup, where there was an actual political and economic stake and a choice between different directions?
Yep.
Or not, or because it doesn't seem to me that we're going to be going off in a wildly different direction than we were during Trump's administration in the years to come.
Yeah.
Am I being too cynical?
I think so. I think I'm going to challenge you here a little bit on that one. Let me see. I think you're absolutely right that really the centerpiece and the cornerstone of Trump's policy agenda, to the extent that he had one, was the $1.5 trillion in tax breaks, which was basically billionaires and very profitable corporations looting the public treasury with nothing in return. Couldn't even be called social investment. That very much parallels many of the things that happened during the Bonapartist regime. And then, of course, we're just allowed to run roughshod, engaging in all kinds of corrupt financial schemes, looting the state at every opportunity, enriching themselves and using public office for that purpose. That, I think, is the biggest parallel. Now, what was beyond that? And this is, I think, what takes us back and that's what big capital got from it. And that's all they want, right? More money. They got it. Now, what is offered to the petite bourgeoisie and the lumpen proletariat? And I think this is the idea that I've tried to use to sort of link those two classes together in a common movement. And it goes to make America great again. It's, I think, anchored in two things. One is nostalgia for the past. Mythical or not, it is this memory of kind of a 1950s America where men went to work in mines and wives stayed home and took care of children. People had a good standard of living and men were men. And a sort of that got eroded in the starting in the mid 70s, but through the 80s and 90s especially. And a lot of people, both petite bourgeoisie and formal workers, have essentially watched their standard of living deteriorate, erode, and decay. Many of them, I would argue, thrown off into the scrap heap of the lumpenproletariat over the course of the last generation. They are aggrieved, and they see they see the solution to their misery and their dissatisfaction as a return to the past. That was exactly what Bonaparte offered to the French petite bourgeoisie. It's what he offered to the lumpenproletariat. In fact, Marx and Engels talk about the lumpenproletariat as sort of the cast-offs of the decay of the old society. Now, theirs was a decaying feudal society. Ours was a decaying industrial society that through deindustrialization spun millions of people off. Now, the political strategy, of course, is who's to blame for that? Well, you would think it was the capitalist class. They're the ones who make the investment decisions, and it's the political class that made the political decisions. But they invoked nationalism, a return to the past, nostalgia. Who's to blame? It's immigrants, it's the Chinese, it's globalization, it's this global elite, right, of which Trump is not part of. And it becomes a diversion. That's the whole purpose of the clown show, in my view. It diverts people off onto a false solution, which Trump never had any intention of delivering to them in the first place, right? He didn't deliver except symbolically. And we could debate whether there was a substantive impact, but he did pull us out of the Paris Climate Accord. He did pull us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He did force Canada and China to marginally renegotiate the NAFTA agreement, all of which, if you look at what some of the Trumps were saying, was he is keeping his commitment to us. He did put America first. Now, it delivered no tangible benefits to them whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And I would argue all it did was sort of legitimate their desire to engage in racist epithets when they're at the grocery store at Walmart. But one can see through the eyes of a Trump supporter a vision in which he was keeping his commitment to make America great again, as they understood that as a return to the past. They got nothing tangible for it. They could argue, and I think Trump would have argued had he got another term, well, this stuff takes a while to kick in, right? It will show up eventually, even though it never.
Well, the job, I mean, they did get, for a while, people got more jobs. That wasn't really due to anything Trump was doing. That was was the economy finally, after the 2008 crisis, beginning to kind of get back on its feet again. There was a bubble, really, during Trump's presidency. But you know, the rhetoric of let's return to the past, to the good old days, you know, you can see that on the left just as much as you can on the right. I mean, the Bernie Sanders campaign is also harkening back to the same post-war boom and the same, you know, New Deal or Fordist days that Trump is apparently harkening back to, but Trump doing so less directly.
Well, really, you know? And the interesting thing about that is a lot of the polling at the time in 2016 showed, had the Democrats nominated Bernie Sanders as their presidential candidate, he would have pulled a lot of those voters into his support. So you're right. There's a parallel, but I think, and it is a nostalgia. I don't know that Sanders could have delivered on that particular promise, but it would have pulled those voters in a very different political direction.
Right. Yeah. Well, but culturally more than materially.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree.
So I'm asking, like, you know, do you think that Reagan was the same kind of Bonapartist figure that Trump is or was? And do you think that Sanders is a Bonapartist figure in the same way that Trump was?
Well, I'll start with Reagan. And I did publish a piece on the Legal Forum blog where I do address the issue of Reagan as kind of the roots of Trumpism. What I would suggest, if you go back to the Reagan administration, I would argue that it is the Reagan regime that actually forged the coalition between sort of big capital and this sort of mass base of petite bourgeois and lumpen proletarians. And the way he forged that alliance was at a cultural level. It was the same appeal to nationalism, make America great again. But I think most importantly, and I really want to emphasize this piece of it, evangelical religion. He brought the evangelicals into the Republican Party. Now, I think the difference between Reagan and a Trump was Reagan always kept them at arm's length. He played them to get their votes. He gave them rhetorical satisfaction with respect to issues like nationalism, racism, abortion, and a whole range of other issues. But they always complained that you talk the talk, but you never walk the walk. You never deliver any of these things to us. I think that set in motion, however, that group who have become increasingly militant, have moved themselves into the mainstream of the Republican Party to the point that they are the Republican. And I use the term Christo-fascism to describe the ideology that motivates these people. And if you ever want to see a concrete example of what Christo-fascism looks like, read the platform of the Texas Republican Party, and it is laid out there for you in black and white. And I think that is where the entire Republican Party is headed. That's why I think Trump's demise doesn't stop this movement at all. In fact, if we go to the far extreme, you look at the data that's been collected by the Southern Poverty Law Center, who tracks hate groups and militia groups. Their data shows that right-wing activity, militant, violent right-wing, escalates during Democratic presidential regimes because there's an increased level of discomfort on their part. And this alludes back to something you raised earlier. I think we're in a sort of hiatus right now, but I think we will see versions of what happened on January 6th start to show up over the course of the next year or two, possibly in state capitals or municipal centers.
Well, I don't disagree, and even if we, and the other thing to put this in the context of, and this is maybe, tell me if I'm not thinking clearly here, and I want to get back to the Sanders question. You dodged
yes.
the
Okay.
Sanders part.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that, but the other thing to consider is that over the summer there was a massive uprising, often violent, that the likes of which I have never seen before. It was every state in the union saw massive protests and rioting and arson. There was an attempt to create a prefigurative space in Seattle to hold the police station and create like a new kind of society in a few city blocks, which I've seen before. That was harkens back to Occupy and other like temporary autonomous zones and other anarchists.
And don't forget that in 1919, Seattle was the host of the Seattle Commune.
Right. So there's a history there. So the uprisings, though, were, I mean, I know that you think that a lot of the arson and the violence maybe was pushed by the right wing. I happen to know people who were involved and knew people who knew people, and I know that there was a love of the window smashing side of the amongst the youth, that felt like it was, real politics in action. That was felt more real than walking around with a placard or marching here and there, and which is maybe also why it got redirected into toppling statues, because that had that same feeling to it.
Which Marx endorsed, by the way, in 1850.
Right. Well, I mean, I think at times it's more than symbolic. But what I thought about it was that it was a spontaneous reaction to the conditions in society. Most of all, that you had a powder keg that was ready to blow, and that the murder of George Floyd set it off. And it was a combination of declining employment, the lockdowns, the threat of infection, social isolation, the long history of racism in the country, and also the feeling that a lot of young people, including white young people, had of rightly that they didn't have a future,
Right.
really, that they
Yep.
were being set loose into a world that had no space for them. These
Yeah.
Zoomer kids.
Hey,
So I also wonder if you can say the same things. I mean, I think you would say the same things about the lumpen, uh, and um, and if what we're talking about here is which party, Democrat or Republicans, ends up recuperating these forces and setting them to work for them. I think the protests over the summer ultimately were taken up as a way to help the Democratic Party. It was a risky move, but I think it worked. And I think so far these movements from the right have been nothing but a liability for the Republican Party, and they will, if they continue, they will continue to undermine electoral support amongst the amount of the base that reliably votes. Um, but my question is, even if we do see more acts of violence and more protests, what do you think the result of that will be? And could the result of that be just a locking down of the country even more completely and an expansion of the security state?
yeah. You make a really good point there, and I agree with everything you've said. If I can build on that a little bit, I think one of the chapters that hasn't received any attention in my book is that I do have a chapter on the Lumpenproletariat as a revolutionary vanguard, building on the work of Frantz Fanon and later of the Black Panthers in the United States, who very much saw it in a much more positive light if it could be organized and directed toward progressive political goals as opposed to reactionary and nostalgic political goals. And I think there is that struggle going on. We can't deny that there is also a sort of a violent wing, sometimes anarchistic, on the left. And I think one of the things that also has not received much attention recently is the rise of left wing militias. The Socialist Rifle Association, the John Brown Club, the Redneck Revolt, who have invoked the old Black Panthers language of community self-defense and who have shown up at some of Black Lives Matters protests and other protests to provide protection against the right-wing militias. There is potential for escalating violence and confrontation in that way. Marx and even there's a whole lineage of thinkers, Marx, Lenin, agreed. The problem, of course, as we saw, is the way in which the state responds to that. The police sit there and watch Kyle Rittenhouse walk off with an AR-15 after just shooting people and don't do a thing, right? Don't even go take him into custody. The left, whenever it engages in some, will be suppressed. The state will react violently, and it will become the opportunity to increase the suppression of the left. As you've mentioned before, many of these right-wing militia groups recruit active duty military and police officers, and I think people, I don't know why I've been surprised at the disproportionate number of veterans and active duty police officers who were participating in the January 6th riots. That they're going to respond differently to right-wing violence than they are to left-wing violence.
Right. And a lot of these militia groups consist of retired or ex-law enforcement and military.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and the Oath Keepers in particular actively recruit as part of their strategy. And then, of course, there's that group, the Constitutional Sheriffs, similarly, who actually, the sheriff of the group that was plotting to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, actually had ties to that group, the Wolverine Watchmen. The sheriff in that county was a member of the Constitutional Sheriffs.
The Kyle Rittenhouse thing I want to comment on and risk getting canceled for, because on the one hand, I totally agree with you that the fact that the police just drove past, first of all, they came around, saw this armed group, gave them water. I don't know who else they gave water to that night, but they gave them water bottles. Bottled water is how I should have said it, because they were filled with water. But anyhow, they gave them water. They didn't seem to be annoyed at all that they were there. The whole situation with this group of armed people protecting, I don't know, like a Ford dealership or something, was well outside the scope of what should be legal, I think.
I
It
agree.
was vigilante justice on the verge of happening. The actual shooting that Kyle Rittenhouse did, it's a different story. He was being chased and he was being fired upon before he turned and fired. So he may have a self-defense case, actually, if in the court of law. We'll see, but I saw the New York Times video coverage. The main difference, though, if you want to like understand the difference between how the right and left are treated, is what's happening to Kyle Rittenhouse compared to the guy who shot a right-wing protester in Portland.
Yes.
That guy, he was not arrested. He was executed on orders of Trump, and it was not covered. It was hardly covered. But this guy, I mean, I'm not a supporter of the guy who shot a right wing, maybe a Proud Boy or Boogaloo Boy or somebody, or Patriot. I think it was Patriot Prayer.
Patriot Prayer. Yeah.
Yeah, guy in Portland. But he, was armed with apparently a gummy worm when he was killed, like within seconds of the police arriving where he was. So it's clear to me that there are times in which the police act as judge, jury, and executioner, and there are times when you get the full extent of, bourgeois due process. And Kyle Rittenhouse is going to get the benefits of due process. What I think we should argue for is that for everybody to get those, the due process, and we should be absolutely alarmed and outraged by the execution of the shooter in Portland. But unfortunately, what I often hear is the desire for Kyle Rittenhouse not to get due process, and any step along the way where he might get a good lawyer and make a defense for himself to be an indication of corruption in the state. So I would push against that.
Everybody should get due process. And even Marx was a great proponent of liberal democracy and the protections of bourgeois rights. It was the platform from which we engage in progressive struggles.
Yeah. So I wanted to say that because I often don't hear that kind of talk. But okay, back to Sanders. Is Sanders a Bonapartist?
No. I know that there are a lot of people who refer to him as a left-wing populist, which sort of makes a moral equivalency between him and a right-wing.
I'm not making a moral equivalency.
No, I'm not saying you are. I'm saying
a formal equivalency.
Some people do. As you pointed out, there are some populist elements in his rhetoric, but I think what we ultimately have to do is, I don't think Bernie Sanders would ever condone or encourage violence on the left. I don't think he would ever talk about canceling election or undermining the legitimacy of the electoral system. I think he is a Bernsteinian democratic socialist coming out of the works of Edward Bernstein, fundamentally, irrevocably committed to an electoral process. And I don't think he would ever seek to set himself up to be a dictator of any kind or an authoritarian populist of any sort. So while, yes, there's a great deal of populism in his rhetoric, I think there are just massive political differences in the style as well as the intent and goals of his campaign.
Yeah. So that gets me to asking you a question that's towards the bottom of the list of questions that I sent you, but I want to ask it now, even though we're not quite at the end of our conversation. Your essay was published in the Socialist Project Journal. What sort of socialism does the Socialist Project embrace? And I'll just ask, is it that same Bernsteinian socialism that Bernie Sanders embraces?
I would say, first of all, let me give you a little background on the Socialist Project. It's a group that's based in Toronto, Canada. A lot of people associated with York University and the University of Toronto are involved in it, but also political activists in the Toronto area are involved in it as well. I would suggest that they are, you mentioned, there may be Trotskyists and Communist Party members involved in it. In fact, I have no doubt that there are. And I'm not a member of the Socialist Project. I was invited there, so I can't speak. Well,
then let me ask you a different question. What are your Marxist politics? Would you align yourself with the Bernsteinian Marxist tradition?
No, I would say I'm to the left of that. If I was to sort of pick and choose, I would say probably somewhat of a Kotskian before 1918. If you wanted to put that in more contemporary terms, uh, would align myself with people like Ralph Miliband. I think you should engage in electoral politics. I think you should pursue them vigorously, but I don't think that exhausts your political action. I think social movements are a vital component of the left, and I don't think that simply winning an election would change anything. If Bernie Sanders had won, I think you have to reconfigure the structure of the state. You have to fundamentally democratize it. Leo Panitch, recently deceased, wrote on that subject. So I would say it's to the left of Bernsteinianism, not as far as Leninism, but somewhere in between. And Kautsky and Miliband would be the two people I'd point to.
Just to clarify for people who may not be following each reference here, the Bernsteinian tradition was one where it was around the turn of the century to 19th to the 20th that this crisis in Marxism arose after a long depression and then a boom. And the Bernstein's position was, look, we don't have to overturn capitalism. We can evolve the capitalist relations into socialism through the use of the state to control and manage capitalist monopolies is sort of how I would summarize that. And there were pretty deep economic thinkers who tried to make the case for that beyond just Bernstein, that later on after him and before him, and that idea, even though at the time it was overturned formally, I think shaped the 20th century politics and led in around the German Revolution, for instance. Then Ralph Miliband, what say something about?
Okay. Yeah. Well, Ralph Miliband was a British academic. He ended up in the United States, but he was always remained active and an important part of the British Labour Party. And he came out of that kind of Bernsteinian tradition that came to shape the British Labour Party. But he was always on the left wing of that party. And at a point in the 1980s, when he felt it had become sort of irrevocably Bernsteinian, he actually left the party, but organized along with people like Tony Benn, right, who were on the left wing of the party. Probably would have been very supportive of Jeremy Corbyn if he was still alive today. But it was this idea that they didn't want to give up the program of reconstructing and building a socialist economy and a socialist society within a democratic political framework. That tended to entail things like, nationalizing large sectors of the financial sector, nationalizing, the railways, on the airlines, things like that. So there was a very traditional kind of state socialist component to it, but it also had a much more thoroughgoing transformation, democratization of the economy, the building of cooperatives, workers' ownership, profit sharing, not just managing a capitalist economy and redistributing income through government programs, but I would say the big redistributing wealth, right? A policy that redistributes wealth ownership, not just income.
So like workers' co-ops and worker-run businesses being the main thing, rather than just we're not talking about redistributing housing or stocks or something like that, but
exactly.
Wealth, the production of wealth as well as the ownership of land or property. So, one of the things that we try to do on this channel, and I have a podcast that we do every couple of weeks called Pop the Left that's been aiming at this, is bringing the history of the struggle for socialism to the viewers, and hopefully, to the extent that we can, taking some of the old debates out of the sectarian left and making them more mainstream. Maybe we won't resolve them any better than the sectarians have, but maybe we can get more people to think about the issues. So what I'll say is that while I have my inclinations about, for instance, the Kautsky-Bernstein debate, the crisis in Marxism, and the people who I align myself with ultimately are more, I don't know if they're orthodox Marxists, but they're more economistic Marxists like Heinrich Grossman. Or today, a living example would be Andrew Kleiman, even though he hates my guts. but um, but nonetheless, I don't have answers to some of these problems. I feel like they are lingering along and continuing to plague
Yeah.
the Marxist left. So what I'll ask you here, in the spirit of trying to get another perspective on the table and to consider the issue without being doctrinaire. So how should the Marxist left understand its relationship to the Democratic Party?
Yeah, boy, that's a big question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I let me suggest a couple of things.
Okay.
One is, we have the Democratic Socialists of America who are inside the Democratic Party, kind of as a caucus, who are the remnants of what was Eugene Debs' old American Socialist Party. There's a long history of how they went from Eugene Debs to being a caucus inside the Democratic
I think some people would say, hey, when Harrington created the DSA, the old Socialist Party was dead.
Yeah.
But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, pretty much so. But it's there, and I think it gives one access to resources and people and organizations that one should deploy for one's benefit. That one should deploy, toward progressive goals. On the other side of this, I don't think that is sufficient. I just don't think it's sufficient. Now that raises the question then, well, should we break out and create a socialist party? And there are those who say, well, if you do that, you just guarantee that the Republicans will always win. I'm not convinced of that. I would certainly support one. I would join it. I would vote for it. But there is a strategy between those two, which I think we could all agree on, which is a social movement strategy. Black Lives Matter is sort of the kernel of that, where you have social movements that are not beholden to a political party, that can mobilize mass movements. It can put pressure from the outside on that party. And it has to be, and I think, Marx, in a very famous address in 1850 of the Central Committee of the Communist League in London, made exactly this point. You have, because elected officials, even if they're socialists or even communists, are elected to office, they're constrained within the boundaries and limitations of capitalist state. That means you have to constantly put pressure on them from the outside. You have to push them, and they will complain about it the entire time. And that's where I think that a Marxist left strategy requires constant social mobilization and social pressure by social movements on the official institutions.
What do you think the hindrance is to creating a socialist party? Because I know that there are plenty of people who would like to, and there are different types of people who would like to. Like, for instance, Adolf Reed was very involved with the Labor Party back in the 90s, and that was maybe not quite the socialist party that a sectarian Marxist would have in mind, but it was at least a step away from the Democrats. But do you think that even if we could withstand a period of time where the Republicans did always win, could we, under those conditions, create a socialist party? What's the block to a socialist party again in America?
That's a very political sciencey question. And
it is.
I would say that the fundamental obstacle to third parties of any kind in this country is the structure of the electoral system created in the U.S. Constitution, which is a winner-take-all system. That means that in a three-party race, so you create a socialist party, you have to be able to win at least 34% of the vote out of the chute to have any chance at winning election if it was evenly split, right? That's one big issue. It's hard to come out of the gate with that magnitude of electoral strength for a new party. And as we saw in the case of the Populist Party back in the 1890s, which came close to that, once they start to show electoral, they're able to cross that threshold, 35, 40% of the vote, start winning. The Republicans and the Democrats will start to run a single candidate. They'll say who's got the strong to defeat it, to preserve the existing system. That compares to a lot of the European parliamentary systems where you have proportional representation, and usually the threshold is if you get 5% of the vote, you will get some representation in the parliament. you can hit that 5% pretty easily and then begin to build from there. So I think it's really the constitutional system of elections we have as compared to a parliamentary system that really makes it difficult for any third party in this country, socialist or otherwise.
And yet, even in the UK, for instance, the socialist movement has been floundering, and the difference between the Tories and the Labour Party is not as vast as one would
No,
expect in a parliamentary system, if that
no,
was the primary problem.
and that takes us to an even bigger issue, which is, the changing class character of advanced capitalist societies, post-industrial capitalist societies. There was a point there, say the 40s, 50s, 60s, and before, where what one could realistically call an industrial proletariat was a majority of the population. And you could build a political program and an electoral platform around that. They're now a comparatively small segment of the population. And, that's not to say we don't have a working class, but it's a much more diffuse and heterogeneous working class than the industrial proletariat. It's scattered in much smaller enterprises, particularly in the service and the retail sector, than were, these big steel factories that employed 15,000 people. So the organizational problems of finding commonality are much more difficult, I think, in post-industrialism than they were in industrial capitalism.
I have two more comments, and then we're coming up on a full hour here. But now I feel like we're just getting going. Now we're really into the thick of it here. But okay, well, in this context, then what's interesting is that something like Amazon could start to be a rebirth of the industrial proletariat in a sense, even though they're not, on assembly lines. Well, they're not on assembly lines, but they are sort of on these conveyor belt lines, right?
Yeah.
And like Rosa Luxemburg thought that the factory system would bring together the proletariat and socialize them as capital concentrated, right? And so it would build solidarity and a political consciousness to be in that kind of condition.
Yeah.
And it seems like working for major corporations where like Amazon can create that kind of sensibility again today. So one question I might have is, when the petit bourgeois and their progressive Democratic Democratic Party representatives push to protect the small industry, is it in the interest of the working class to ignore them and hope for more concentration of monopoly power in the country, because the working class will be more likely to be politically activated when pushed into those conditions, and also maybe even have better living conditions when working for big major corporations?
Yeah. Great observations. That's been a pet peeve of mine for a very long time. Is this fascination with small capital, which tends to provide low wages and no or poor benefits, and yet Democrats will glorify small business as the backbone of the American economy. I'll make two observations on that. Going to the Amazon, there is some really good work being done. I'll mention Kim Moody as one example of what's being done there. Is that it's very clear that as the economy has globalized, there are significant choke points in the capitalist economy around the issues of logistics. Amazon's a great example of that. But airports, seaports, there are these huge distribution hubs in the global economy where there are large concentrations of workers, and they don't have to necessarily be a majority, but where they can absolutely cripple an economy if they go on strike, much like the old French railway workers used to do back in the days of their heyday of their radicalism. So I would say that as capitalism always does, it generates its own contradictions. And I would say that's one that we can identify, where workers do have the capacity to organize, they do have the ability to unionize, and they do have the ability to exert economic leverage far out of proportion to their numbers. And there have been times in the old days, if we go back to industrial capitalism, where they acted sort of as a vanguard of the working class. The railway workers were always in that position, back in the 1880s, well up until the 20th century. Auto workers later became that group. So I think logistics workers are now the people who occupy that position structurally, and it could become an economic foundation to build on.
Yeah, I interviewed Chris Smalls. Do you know who Chris Smalls is?
I know the name, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, he's the guy at the Amazon warehouse in I think Rhode Island, and it was really interesting talking to him. He was a very brave guy, and he was smart too. He's like he thought about how to handle the media. Like for instance, an example is that he decided to have his walkout at lunchtime. So,
Yeah.
so that everyone was walking out anyway, and the media cameras in there, and everyone's leaving for lunch, so it looks like a very big thing. But the thing about Chris Smalls is that he has been, he's had his tour through the left-wing media landscape. He's been on a variety of programs. He's still working hard, and trying to organize people, but he's isolated.
Yeah.
And the very best he can do is get support from a pretty fractured, movement-oriented left. And it seems like if there was some sort of institutional support that Chris could be working with, some sort of institution, like maybe a socialist party that Chris could be working with, he would be in a much better position to help organize the Amazon workers than he is on his own, using great technology and with some, at least moral support from people like myself and others, but not any real everyday logistical support. So I'm wondering, but do you think that maybe building a socialist party, the first step wouldn't be electoral, but would be run along the lines of helping worker-led movements like what Chris Smalls is doing?
Yeah, I think it's a parallel process. I think you need to do both. And, if I can invoke Lyd in here, I think organization is always the problem. It's always the problem of organization. There's no easy solution to it. There's no easy answer to it. It's boots on the ground, or maybe it's fingers on a keyboard today. But you have to organize, and it's a process that never stops. It has to go on continuously. And that is, what can I say? It's organizing.
Right.
Joe Hill said that, right? The IWW, organize, boys, organize.
Yeah.
On his deathbed.
Well, I think maybe that would be the perfect spot to end the conversation this time. So I'm going to stop recording, but